with ICE, there are so many different so-called Christian groups that have been sounding off about this and claiming that, you know, the Christian thing to do is to just welcome everybody into our country, and that, well, what's that?
Including the Roman Catholic Church.
They're
Yeah.
among the ones
Yeah.
leading the charge.
Yeah.
Bottom line is, regardless of which side of that fence you want to come down on,
That sounds like a
not
rooster.
a chicken.
It was Mr. R.
Mhm. Okay, anyway, regardless of which side of that fence you want to come down on, the bottom line is, if you come into somebody's country illegally, you are by definition a criminal. And it is causing the church no end of problems, and it is destroying the witness of the church that you've got one Christian group supporting ICE, other Christian group saying ICE is terrible. We should support the illegal aliens.
Immigrants, they're not illegal, they're
Yeah,
immigrants.
well, they're illegal.
They won't use that word though.
Well, but the bottom line is, folks, the world, it's going to be real hard to see revival start in this country. Not to say that God can't and won't do it. I don't discount anything God's capable of doing. But what the world is seeing as we are trying to witness in the midst of all this is you got one Christian group saying one thing, another Christian group saying something else, and again, keep in mind that while we can look at various groups and say, no, their actions prove they're not Christians, the world doesn't see that. The world cannot understand that. All the world sees is that you've got different denominations all claiming to be Christians, and nobody's agreeing with anybody else, and it's hurting the cause of Christ, and the devil is laughing the whole time.
I don't think it's hurting God's efforts for revival though. I think he can do it on his own without,
Well,
no matter
well,
what impediment we put
Well,
in the way,
as I
you
just
know,
mentioned, God
yeah.
can cause bring revival
still
if he wants
happening.
to or not.
I mean, if you see what's happening even in the NFL right now, with the witness that's happening with the quarterback and the winning team, C.J. Stroud, he's giving all the glory to God for everything that happens. You know, and so there's some real witnessing going on in this country right now
And
in a major way.
And you did not hear come out of my mouth that God can't bring revival.
But I bet if you asked Strout what he thought about the illegal immigrants, he'd say that, well, they should be allowed in here. I would almost guarantee you. That's exactly what the problem is.
But I guess where I'm going with all this is, as we're praying for our country, maybe we're praying for the wrong thing. We're praying about the symptoms, and we need to be praying about the problem. And the problem is that the devil has got his foot in the door in the church, and we got church groups that have gone off the deep end and have become apostate, and it's ruining the witness of the legitimate church.
And the press follows what they want to hear, which is not the real
Mhm.
word.
And Trump isn't helping in that respect, because on one day you'll hear come out of Trump's mouth something that sounds almost very godly and Christ-like, and the next day foul language and obscenities and
Ford worker told the Ford, you know,
Yeah, he flipped off and, cussed out a guy at Ford yesterday, I guess it was, when the appropriate thing would have been just to ignore him. So, and of course the world sees, all those evangelicals and those conservative Christians are pro-Trump. No, we're pro-God. But anyway, so my point is that we need to be praying, yes, for revival, but praying and recognizing that the problem is not illegal aliens. The problem is the devil. And he will use whatever methods he can to disrupt the church and evangelism. And that's not unlike what we're going to see here in our passage of Scripture, which I'll tie that in a minute. But we are on chapter 41. Now, to just kind of bring you up to speed, remember where we left off at last week was that Joseph saw fit to basically tell Pharaoh what he ought to do and explain to Pharaoh what kind of person he ought to be looking for. And I think what Pharaoh was doing in all of this was looking at Joseph and realizing that he's looking at the man that fits the description. Now, as a reminder, it is believed by many. Now, keep in mind, we have no proof of this because a lot of the events around Joseph, we don't have an exact date on, but it is believed that probably the Pharaoh who was king over Egypt at this particular time may very well have been a non-Egyptian who was himself distantly related, probably an Abrahamic descendant, but somehow distantly related to the Jews, not himself a Jew, or by any means closely related, but possibly someone who may have been of that generic bloodline, which is why he might have been open to having a Hebrew advise him. So, with that in mind, as a possibility, verse 40, he says, "You shall be over my house, and according to your command, all my people shall do homage. Only in the throne I will be greater than you." Now, all I can think of is if Potiphar, who you know as chief of the bodyguard, Potiphar would have been present in the throne room when somebody else was brought in to address Pharaoh. I mean, Potiphar wouldn't have been doing his job not to have been there. And I can't even begin to imagine what Potiphar would have been thinking as he sees his former slave that he threw in the prison being told by Pharaoh, "You're now second over all of Egypt." I wonder if Potiphar was thinking, uh-oh.
He might have been a little bit proud.
Maybe.
This is my guy. I found this guy.
Well, maybe, but on the other hand, he also threw that guy in prison.
Kept him there.
But we're going to see that in the long run in this, you got to figure, I'm convinced, for multiple reasons, God has got a sense of humor. Not the least of which he created us with one. But this is, as we get in deeper into this, you'll see this is one of those things that you figure only God could have come up with this. And I'll tell you when we get to that point. But it says, "Only in the throne I will be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I've set you over all the land of Egypt." And by the way, at that particular time, Egypt did not cover if you look at a map of Egypt today, that wasn't the land of Egypt at the time. Egypt basically consisted of a strip of land on either side of the Nile River that went southward probably about 300 or 400 miles. Anything past that, away from the Nile, was just nothing but desert. I mean, there was nothing out there. You couldn't survive in that area. So Egypt as a nation pretty much was the northern Nile Delta. Now, occasionally you will see commentaries refer to Upper and Lower Egypt. We tend to think of something that's upper as being north. If you come across any references to Upper versus Lower Egypt in a commentary, it's the exact opposite. Upper Egypt was actually southern Egypt.
Nubia.
Well, yeah, as you got down into that area, but
It's higher ground.
yeah, that's what you got to be looking for.
The
is
Nile's flowing downhill to the
think
Mediterranean.
that exactly, as the Nile River is flowing downhill toward the Mediterranean, the downhill, which is the northern section, was considered Lower Egypt. All right. Then Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put the gold necklace around his neck. All right, now for Joseph to have Pharaoh's signet ring, that basically gives Joseph the authority to issue any decree he wants to. And all he's got to do is, put the wax seal on it, stick the signet ring into it, and it is official. And in fact, has the force of Pharaoh's authority. So for Joseph to have the signet ring, what's that?
Auto pen. It's an auto pen.
Well, I won't go there tonight. But anyway, the bottom line is this definitely confirms Joseph is now in charge. Verse 43 says, he had him ride on his second chariot, and they proclaimed before him, bow the knee, and he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, though I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission, no one shall raise his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh's made it clear to Joseph that, buddy, you are now in charge, which seems, for someone who a day before was in prison and now just comes and interprets a dream for him and then dares to give him advice on how to go about dealing with the interpretation, and now Pharaoh promotes him to essentially prime minister, that tells you Pharaoh's
being motivated by God.
He's got motivated by God, but
Jewish.
that gives you some indication that possibly, while again, I'm not claiming Pharaoh is by any means a man of God, but is it possible, if the historians are correct, that this particular Pharaoh may have been non-Egyptian from a Semitic tribe north of there, in where Abraham had come from, that even if he didn't necessarily worship the true God, if when Joseph is telling him that his God is interpreting all this and his God has done all of this, would lend some credibility to the possibility that Pharaoh may have at least been familiar with belief in this particular God, because he's certainly given Joseph a lot of leeway here.
Or at least predisposed to believe in gods other than the Egyptian gods.
Other than the Egyptian God.
So it's pretty obvious he had the intel then on Joseph. I mean, he knew where he came from. And,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
So this strengthens the possibility that the historians may be correct about this particular Pharaoh. Because, let's draw a comparison. The Pharaoh of a generation later that did not know Joseph had no respect whatsoever for any of for these gods. When Moses went into that Pharaoh's presence and said, God has ordered me, to come talk to you to let his people go, and this is the God. That Pharaoh clearly didn't have a clue.
Yeah, his belief was your God has no power here.
Your God doesn't mean anything to me. We don't see that with this Pharaoh. So either one of two, or possibly both of these two possibilities, is one, God specifically softened this Pharaoh's heart to be to listen to what Joseph had to offer, or he had heard of this God before and knew of some of the things that this God had been known for. And I'm sure he probably at this point had been given some briefing on who Joseph was.
You think there could be any link to Abraham and Sarah and all that? What happened, do you think? If it was too far away.
Maybe, but I doubt it, because we're talking,
Generation.
3 generations later.
Yep.
If Pharaoh knew anything about that, it would have been from stories passed down from his father or grandfather.
Right.
He may have been a descendant of Shem and not necessarily a descendant of Abraham.
Well, true. All right. Then Pharaoh named Joseph Zephanath-Paneah, which the commentators, of course, don't know for sure, because you're talking about an ancient dialect of Egyptian that even today only bits and pieces are known of. Nobody knows that particular dialect of Egyptian to the degree, like, say, they knew Aramaic or Hebrew or things of that sort. But it's believed that it may be something to the to the effect of God speaks and he lives. That's their best guess as to the meaning of that name. But it says he named Joseph Zephanath-Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, as his wife. Now, here's where I say this clearly kind of tells me God's got a sense of humor. Now, I looked this up, and the difference between the name Potiphar and Potipharah is simply Potiphar is believed to have been nothing more than a nickname or a shortened version of Potipharah, in the same sense that
So Potipharah was both a male and female name?
nope, Potipharah is still a male name. I realize that it's got an A on the end, but that's Spanish and Italian and Romance languages. That wouldn't have any effect at all on Egyptian. But it wouldn't be any different than calling somebody whose name is Thomas, Tom, or Jimmy and Jim. Got to leave again?
I gotta leave again. He's okay, but she's talking about going to Walgreens to get his prescription with him.
With him?
With him. She won't leave him home alone.
Can't trust me. Yeah.
I understand not leaving alone, but
She should be.
Karen does.
She don't be driving either.
Karen sometimes does not use common sense. But anyway, I'm not going to get into that today. Now, the priest of On, and later, like several hundred years later, the Egyptian city of Heliopolis was where the city of On used to be.
So
And-
On was off.
Huh?
So in that case, On was off.
And the point I was going to make was that Joseph marries a pagan wife.
Yeah, but before we get into that, go slap that man.
I'm trying to be serious here.
We're going to get to that in a minute. All right. On was the Egyptian sun god. And whether it be Potiphar or Potipharah, linguistically, it was the same name. So what you have here is the man who's thrown in prison for messing around with the wife of Potiphar, which he didn't do, now is being presented as a wife, the daughter
Of Potiphar.
of a guy by the same name. Now, yes, she was a pagan, but you gotta shake your head at this and wonder, did God do this just in spite of them? Just like, nope. He was honest. He didn't mess with her, so I'm going to give him the daughter of someone with the same name. Now, was she a pagan? Yes. So here's where we kind of run into a problem. Joseph does end up marrying a woman who was of pagan belief. Although I can't help but wonder if Joseph at some point, now by the way, to be presented with this woman as a wife by Pharaoh and to tell Pharaoh no would have probably that would have been seriously costly.
Bad idea.
Yeah, seriously bad idea. But I can't help but wonder at this point if Joseph possibly sat her down and explained to her who the true God was. Because when Joseph has two sons, when she presents him with two sons, the two sons are named with Hebrew names, not Egyptian, Hebrew names. So,
Well, that would be natural because their father's Hebrew, right?
Well,
yeah, but back then, a lot of times it was the women that named the
The
kids.
women named the babies.
Okay, yeah, you're right.
Mhm.
Okay.
But anyway, it says, and Joseph went forth over the land of Egypt. Now, why? Because, well, they didn't exactly have TV news, so to proclaim that Joseph is now prime minister, he would have had to have gone in Pharaoh's chariot, dressed in all of Pharaoh's clothes, with an entourage up and down the Nile River to all of the other Egyptian towns.
Parade around and let everybody know who's in charge.
Exactly. So everybody throughout Egypt knows who Joseph is and that he is now in charge. Not just Pharaoh, but they report through Joseph. So yes, this was his coronation tour, if you will. Verse 46, now Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Now, how old was he when he got sold into slavery?
17.
17. So in 13 years, he's learned to speak fluent Egyptian. He's gone from a bratty kid to to slave, to prisoner, to prime minister, all in the space of 13 years. Think this little bratty kid did some growing up somewhere in that process? But that's, I believe, why God did not just put him immediately into this position. God gave him 13 years to grow up.
It wasn't just behavioral maturity, it was spiritual maturity too.
Mm-hmm. But there's a downside of it, which we probably won't get to it tonight, but we will on Sunday. Anyway, verse 47 says, and during the 7 years of plenty, the land brought forth abundantly. And actually the Hebrew term that is, it brought all the crops brought forth by handfuls. Now, we wouldn't think of a handful as being a whole lot, but that's a Hebrew term that basically means there was a lot of surplus. So he gathered all the food of these 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt, and placed the food in the cities. He placed in every city the food from its own surrounding fields. Now, you'll recall I had mentioned that one of the things that Joseph established, and it's known from historical records, that all up and down the Nile River, all of the major food-producing centers, he established storehouses and taxation points where every time, when the crops came in, when they brought, the farmers brought their crops in, they had to pony up a big chunk of it. Well, 20% was what Joseph demanded. Had to pony up 20% of it to what was now Pharaoh's storehouse.
And they had lots and lots of cats to protect the stored grain from the rats.
Only you would think of that.
They revered the cats.
Maybe.
Killing a cat was a death penalty in Egypt.
At some point. I don't know if it was at that point. All right, verse 49. Thus Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he stopped measuring it, for it was beyond measure. 20% of all the grain surplus for 7 years. Now, for that to have supplied not only just Egypt, but even surrounding nations in the 7 years of famine, what does that tell you about the crop surplus during those 7 years?
That abundance was
A
amazing.
lot of abundance. God provided for them. The question you might ask at this point, though, and we're gonna stop there because I'm gonna save the remaining of the part of the chapter for Sunday. But the question that I would have is, why did God bring this about? Not just to put Joseph in this particular position. I mean, if he wanted to raise the spiritual maturity level of one man, there were plenty of other ways to do it. Why bring about 7 years of surplus and then 7 years of famine?
To save the nation of Israel.
Yeah, that's what
To
Moses
create the
told.
nation of Israel.
Yeah,
Save the nation of Israel.
I think Merrill is more on target, not to, because keep in mind, at this point, the nation of Israel didn't exist.
They were a single family
Well, yeah,
at this
the
point.
family of Israel did.
6 million in Goshen.
Yeah, but even then, it was only his kids and grandkids and a bunch of servants and what have you. There was no hint at this point of a nation. Now, what single event, and yes, one single event in all of history, if you ask any Jew that knows anything about their history, what produced the nation
The
of
Exodus.
Israel? It's the Exodus. And the Exodus would not have happened unless all of these events had occurred. Because what would have prompted Jacob to take his entire family out of Canaan, and what was for him the promised land, to go to Egypt to begin with, and then be willing to stay there? Not just food, but when he went there, who did he find in charge?
His own son.
His own son. All of this was orchestrated by God to get Jacob and his family into Egypt and for them to stay there, and yes, even slavery for several generations, because it was the Exodus that turned them from being just a huge family and their descendants into a nation. But anyway,
It's also where God sent Mary and Joseph to raise Jesus until it was safe for him to return to
Oh, come out.
the promised land.
Well, what would have happened if the Pharaoh had, if Joseph hadn't invited his family to Egypt and they starved to death? Where would the Israelites be?
God would have come up with some other means, but you're also trying to second guess God. I'm pretty sure God knew what would happen.
Yeah.
I know, but you know.
But no, there is no, you can't say there's a yes, but. God knew what was going to happen. And
He'd already seen it happen.
God orchestrated the events in such a way to bring about exactly what he knew would happen.
Agreed.
Amen.
So anyway, any other questions?